At 6:01 in the morning, a terrified husband called 911 from a house in Lakewood, Colorado. His wife was not breathing. Patrick Ted Barnett told the dispatcher that 37-year-old Lindsey Barnett had cut herself. He said she had cut her throat. And when emergency crews arrived, Lindsey was exactly where Ted said she was, inside the shower. A serrated knife was nearby. 2 young children, a toddler and an infant, were still inside the home. At first glance, this appeared to be a horrifying suicide. But then police walked into the bedroom, and almost immediately, the story began to fall apart. There was blood across the bed, blood on the sheets, blood on the pillow, what appeared to be blood clots, and a trail that seemed to lead away from the bed toward the bathroom. Yet investigators reported comparatively little blood around Lindsey's body in the shower. That raised an immediate question. If Lindsey had suffered a catastrophic neck wound in the bathroom, why did the bedroom look like the center of the violence? Within hours, detectives were no longer treating the house like the scene of a straightforward suicide. By the end of the day, Lindsey's husband was under arrest, and 6 days later, prosecutors charged Patrick Barnett not only with first-degree murder after deliberation, but also with tampering with a deceased human body and tampering with physical evidence. Those are allegations. Barnett is presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. But investigators now believe the most important part of this case may be what happened before Lindsey ever reached that shower. Lindsey Barnett was 37 years old. She was a mother, and she was an elementary school art teacher serving the Hutchinson and Westgate school communities in Jefferson County, Colorado. People who knew her described a woman deeply involved with her students. She helped organize special projects. She devoted herself to the district art show. And as a new school year approached, Lindsey was supposed to be preparing to return to her classroom. Instead, on the morning of August 13, 2026, emergency crews were racing to her home. Ted Barnett told investigators that the marriage had been struggling for months. The couple was sleeping separately. Lindsey slept in the main bedroom. Ted said he had been sleeping downstairs in the basement. According to his account, he woke at around 5:30 that morning. He heard the shower running upstairs. He went up and eventually found Lindsey badly injured. He called 911 shortly after 6, but detectives quickly began questioning what they saw inside the house. Lindsey had a severe cut across the front of her neck. Investigators described it as approximately 5 to 6 inches long. The injury appeared to have damaged a major artery. A serrated knife roughly 5 inches long was found beside her, but the location of Lindsey's body did not seem to explain the rest of the scene. The bedroom contained a significant amount of blood. Investigators documented blood across portions of the bed. They reported blood on bedding and pillows, and they observed what appeared to be blood clots. Then they noticed what seemed to be a blood trail moving from the bedroom toward the bathroom. That detail mattered, because blood can tell investigators much more than simply that someone was injured. Where it appears, where it does not appear, and how it is distributed can help reconstruct movement through a crime scene. And detectives were beginning to suspect that Lindsey had not suffered the fatal violence where she was eventually found. Near the bed, officers discovered another unusual detail. A plant had been knocked over. Soil had spilled across the floor. The dirt appeared to extend in the direction of the bathroom. Police also documented a small bloody footprint near the bed that investigators described as appearing to have been made by a woman's foot. Later forensic processing reportedly revealed additional blood between the bedroom and bathroom that had not been obvious to the naked eye. The picture was becoming more complicated. The bathroom told one story. The bedroom appeared to tell another. And then detectives began examining Lindsey's injuries. There was more than the wound to her neck. Investigators documented bruises on several areas of her body, including her arms, legs, back, and hips. They described a recent injury on one knee, a scratch on her shoulder, and a cut on her left index finger. One detective wrote that the finger injury appeared consistent with a defensive wound. That does not, by itself, establish exactly what happened. But it gave investigators another reason to question the idea that Lindsey had simply injured herself while alone. Then they looked at Ted. Detectives photographed several marks on his body. They documented scratches and cuts on his upper arm, chest, abdomen, and near his collarbone. An investigator described some of those marks as appearing consistent with fingernail scratches or defensive injuries. There was also an injury on Ted's thumb. Ted reportedly told detectives that the thumb injury was older. He said he had hurt it while playing ultimate frisbee in July and that the scab had recently come off. But investigators noticed something else. What appeared to be dried blood was visible on Ted's neck and into his beard. There was also what detectives described as a faint smear of blood behind his right ear, and yet, according to the arrest affidavit, his hands did not appear bloody. That was difficult for investigators to reconcile with his description of what he had done after finding Lindsey. Ted said he had touched her. He said he had moved her head. At another point, he reportedly described partially lifting her while attempting to check for signs of life. So detectives wanted to know, if that contact explained the blood on his neck and near his ear, why were his hands apparently clean? Ted gave investigators another explanation for some of the blood on him. He said that after finding Lindsey, he sat on the blood-covered bed while talking to the 911 dispatcher. But that explanation created an even larger question. Why was the bed covered in so much blood in the first place? The investigators' focus was shifting, not toward the shower, toward the bedroom. And eventually, detectives told Ted exactly what they believed. According to the affidavit, they said Lindsey had died on the bed, and they told him they did not believe she had gotten from that bed into the shower by herself. Ted continued to insist that he had discovered her in the bathroom. He said he did not know what had happened before he found her. He could not explain, investigators wrote, how the physical evidence fit his account. But the forensic scene was only one side of the case. Detectives were also beginning to examine what had been happening inside the Barnett marriage. Ted acknowledged that the relationship had been troubled. The couple had been sleeping apart. According to the affidavit, there had been disagreements involving communication, parenting, depression, and intimacy. The couple had even traveled to Scotland earlier that summer in an attempt to improve their marriage. A friend reportedly went with them and sometimes acted as a relationship intermediary. But by August, the problems had not disappeared. Ted told investigators about tension inside the house the night before Lindsey died. One disagreement allegedly involved dinner. Lindsey had served fish sticks. Ted reportedly said he did not approve of fried food. He described Lindsey as becoming distant afterward. According to his account, she did not want to talk. Ted said he eventually went downstairs to sleep. He reportedly last saw Lindsey sometime around 10 or 10:30 that night. Hours later, according to Ted, he heard the shower. That was his explanation of the morning. But before that day was over, detectives would learn there was another person in Ted's life. During early questioning, investigators asked about infidelity. According to the affidavit, Ted initially denied that either he or Lindsey had been unfaithful. Then another woman contacted police. She was worried about Ted. She reportedly told investigators that she had not heard from him since around 11 o'clock the night before, and she identified herself as his girlfriend. That changed the investigation immediately. The woman told detectives that she and Ted had met online approximately 3 months earlier, but what she believed about Ted's marriage was especially important. According to investigators, she thought Ted and Lindsey were separated. She thought they were going through a divorce, and she apparently believed Lindsey was no longer living in the family home. That was not all. The girlfriend reportedly told detectives that Ted had described Lindsey as having serious mental health problems. According to the affidavit, she said Ted had told her that Lindsey had previously received psychiatric care, and that Lindsey had recently attempted suicide while Ted was away camping. Those claims now mattered enormously, because Ted had just told authorities that Lindsey's fatal neck wound was self-inflicted. Detectives needed to know whether Lindsey actually had a history that supported that account. So they spoke with her mother. Lindsey's mother gave investigators a different picture. She acknowledged that Lindsey had experienced depression. Ted had also told authorities that his wife had struggled with depression before and after childbirth. But Lindsey's mother said her daughter had never expressed suicidal intent. She said Lindsey had never attempted suicide, and she said Lindsey was planning for the future. She was preparing for the coming school year. She cared deeply about her children, and according to her mother, nothing Lindsey had said suggested that she intended to end her life. The competing accounts did not prove what happened inside the house, but they created another contradiction investigators had to examine. There was also more information about the marriage. Lindsey's mother told detectives that the relationship had become increasingly difficult. She described Ted as verbally abusive and controlling toward her daughter. She did not tell investigators that she had witnessed physical abuse, but she recalled arguments in which Ted yelled while Lindsey remained calm. She also said that months before Lindsey's death, Lindsey had come to her parents' home alone because she needed to get away from him. Again, those statements are allegations and witness accounts. They have not been tested before a jury. A difficult marriage does not prove murder. An affair does not prove murder. And conflicting descriptions of someone's mental health do not prove murder. What mattered to detectives was how those pieces fit together with the physical evidence. Because when investigators questioned Ted again, his account of the other relationship changed. He now acknowledged the girlfriend. But he reportedly told detectives that Lindsey knew about the relationship, and he claimed she had no problem with it. Investigators were now looking at multiple areas where they believed Ted's statements either changed or failed to explain the evidence. First, he said Lindsey had injured herself, but investigators believed the blood evidence pointed toward the bed. He said he found her in the shower, but detectives believed her body had been moved there. He described physical contact with Lindsey, yet investigators questioned the blood pattern they observed on his body. He initially denied an affair, then acknowledged one after his girlfriend contacted police. And detectives had documented injuries on both Lindsey and Ted that they believed required explanation. At some point, the case had crossed a line. Investigators were no longer simply trying to determine whether Lindsey had taken her own life. They were building a homicide case. Later on August 13th, police located Ted Barnett during a traffic stop in Evergreen, Colorado. He was taken into custody. Detectives brought him back to Lakewood for additional questioning, and he was booked into the Jefferson County Jail. Initially, authorities announced that he was being held on suspicion of first-degree murder. But then came a major development. On August 19th, prosecutors formally filed 3 charges: first-degree murder after deliberation, tampering with a deceased human body, and tampering with physical evidence. Those second and third charges immediately raised the stakes, because now prosecutors were not merely alleging that Lindsey had been killed. They were also alleging that something was done to her body, and that physical evidence was tampered with. The charging document itself does not prove how prosecutors intend to establish those accusations, and the government will eventually have to support every element of every charge in court. But those counts appear consistent with the central theory described by investigators in the arrest affidavit, that the location where Lindsey was found was not the location where the fatal violence occurred. That theory makes the bedroom one of the most important areas in the entire case. What exactly happened on that bed? When did the fatal injury occur? How much can blood pattern analysis reveal? Can investigators determine Lindsey's movements during her final minutes? Can they determine whether she moved toward the bathroom herself, or whether someone moved her? And what do the injuries documented on both Lindsey and Ted actually mean? Those answers may come from evidence the public has not yet seen. The complete autopsy has not been publicly laid out in court. Detailed DNA findings have not been publicly presented. The public has not heard the complete 911 call in context. Digital evidence, including phones, messages, internet activity, and location data, could also become important. And prosecutors have not publicly established a final motive. That is important because motive is one of the questions many people immediately ask. There was marital conflict. There was another relationship. There were different stories about what that girlfriend had been told. But those facts should not be turned into a motive unless prosecutors can connect them through evidence. For Lindsey's family, students, and colleagues, however, this case is already much larger than a courtroom theory. Hutchinson Elementary School described Lindsey as a beloved art teacher, a woman who brought energy and creativity into the classroom, someone who worked across 2 school communities, someone who poured herself into projects for children. The school's principal remembered her as kind, passionate about art education, and deeply dedicated to her students. Mental health support was made available to students and staff as the community tried to understand what had happened. Lindsey was supposed to be preparing for another school year. Instead, her classroom is now missing the teacher who was expected to return, and her 2 young children have lost their mother. For now, Patrick Barnett remains accused, not convicted. He has the right to challenge the forensic evidence, His defense can dispute investigators' interpretation of the scene. They can challenge witness statements. They can challenge the meaning of the injuries. And they can present another explanation for the blood inside the house. That is what the court process is for. But the prosecution now faces an equally clear task. It must explain why investigators believe Lindsey died in the bedroom. It must establish what happened to her body afterward. It must prove why the scene allegedly does not match Ted's 911 account. And for the most serious charge, prosecutors must prove that the killing was committed after deliberation. Beyond a reasonable doubt, Patrick Barnett is scheduled to return to court as this case begins moving through the Colorado judicial system. And as more evidence becomes public, the picture may change. But right now, one detail continues to sit at the center of everything. The shower was running. Lindsey's body was inside. A knife was nearby. And her husband told police that she had done this to herself. But detectives did not stop at the bathroom. They followed the blood. Back through the house. Back toward the overturned plant. Back toward the footprint. And ultimately, back to the bed. That is where investigators believe this story truly began. And that is where prosecutors may now have to prove exactly what happened to Lindsey Barnett during the final hours of her life.